Hello, I'm Kay Trimberger. I'm the author of Creole Son, an adoptive mother untangles nature and nurture, which I'll be talking about today. Here is a photograph of about with me and my son about a year and a half ago. He was in his late 30s, and the book is about him, and he's also written an afterword, and I'll be reading a little bit of what he wrote in the afterword. I am speaking to you from Berkeley, California, where I have lived for many years and where I raised my son, my adopted son, born in Louisiana, in southern Louisiana. I'm a emeritus professor at Sonoma State University, where I taught sociology and women's and gender studies. Let me start by just reading an epigram that I used to start my book with a definition of a Louisiana Creole. Gumbo, that's what we are, a little bit of everything, black, white, French, Indian, a delicious stew. And that is from Bliss Broyard, whose memoir, One Drop, I like. So my son was born to a white Cajun mother and a light-skinned Creole father in southern Louisiana. He was delivered to me at the San Francisco airport in January 1981 when he was 5 days old. He was brought to the Bay Area by the OBGYN who had delivered him. And, it was sort of surreal getting a baby at the airport, but I immediately fell in love with him. What's interesting is that 26 years later, I helped him reunite with his birth parents in Louisiana. It was a private adoption that I did through networks, where for 4 years I'd been trying to adopt a baby. And I did have the phone number of the birth mother's mother, but I never contacted them, which I would not do now, which I would do now, because I was afraid. Everybody's afraid. And I always we had a picture of the birth mother who was white, but looked a lot more like Marco than I did. And I always told him when he's 21, he could go and meet them, even though at around 10, he started saying he'd like to meet them. So at any rate, there he was at the airport. He was really cuddly and I really loved him. But 26 years later, I did help him when he was 26. I helped him find his birth parents find his birth mother in Louisiana, which I hired a finder to do for very little money. And I later found out that most adoptees who reunite use somebody else because Marco, my son, was afraid of rejection, afraid to do it. So I did it for him, and I'll tell you some of my reasons why I really wanted him to find these birth parents. I'll tell them later. And it was very easy to find the birth mother, and she was very eager to meet him. And she helped him find the birth father, and she wanted him to come immediately to visit, but he needed a little time to do that. But eventually he went for 10 days, and then later for 6 months, later for 4 months, and lived with both the birth mother and the birth father at times. The fact that they were very open and very accepting of him, not only the birth parents, but their extended families, made it easy for him. And I also, a couple of years later, I went to meet them. And then I went another time by myself. I went the second time to take a workshop on Creole and Cajun culture at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. And what was sort of amazing was that the lively white woman who taught and organized the seminar came from the same hometown that Marco's birth parents did and where he was born. And she used the same OBGYN, or had used the same OBGYN, and had the same opinion of him that I had. So let me just read a little bit about this experience. All the years of fantasizing about Marco's origins melted away. I was here in Louisiana talking to someone who knew the doctor who had delivered Marco, the doctor whom I had met ever so briefly in the airport, a Louisiana woman who confirmed my experience of his racism. Ironically, if Dr. Brusand, that's a pseudonym, as most, except for my son's name, which he chose to have his own name, everybody else is pseudonyms. And sometimes I've changed some of their characteristics. Ironically, if Dr. Brusand had been less racist, he might never have sent the baby so far away. So, and I would not have raised Marco. So that was really interesting. And I think, we should know that birth parents, not birth parents, but adoptive parents also really fantasize about what the origins of their child was, unless it's an open adoption, which now is completely advocated to have an open adoption, although that can mean many different things. It was actually finding his birth parents and relating to them, and both of us relating to them, that led me to write this book. But before I go into why that led me to write this book, let me read something that both my son in the afterword to this book, and he really liked the book, and which I didn't know if he would, because I'd asked him to read it, but he didn't. And then finally, I really pressured him to read it before I had a publisher, before I started finding a publisher. And I was thrilled that he really liked it, and that he offered to write an afterword, to write his sort of take on some of the things that I had said in the book. And there was only a couple of things that he wanted me to change. So this is his discussing in his afterword, his first connections to his birth family. I remember meeting my birth mom first, then my brothers, and then my father, who was the person I wanted to meet most. I appreciate that my birth mom had told her other children about my existence, that she was so welcoming, and that she helped me find my birth dad. Louisiana was a welcome change to the fast-paced city life of the San Francisco Bay Area where I was raised. I remember that when I first arrived at my biological mother's mobile home in the middle of a sugarcane field, there were no sidewalks, and the nearest store was a 45-minute walk. I was used to living in a city with busy streets, houses all bunched together, and a store on almost every corner. But I liked being in the country. The food was also different and interesting. I remember the first time I looked in the fridge. Instead of finding ground beef, pork, or chicken, I saw deer sausage, squirrel, and duck. I couldn't wait to get a taste of these meats that I didn't even know people still ate. I thought all those stories of eating frog legs, raccoon, and squirrel were just stories, or things people said to make jokes about the South. When I was living with my birth mom, I ate the sausage, squirrel, frog legs, and duck. Later, my dad cooked coon, rabbit, turtle, and armadillo. I liked them all, but my favorite was squirrel. I love the energy people put out in Louisiana, with friendly smiles all around. I was always worried about racism in the South, but I didn't get that type of vibe from people. I'm sure there are still racist thoughts and practices in Louisiana, but I experienced more in liberal California. Meeting my birth family was very important. It was the key to my being comfortable in my own skin. It gave me a new sense of self and made me feel more okay with my life. So that's Marco's discussion of first meeting his birth family. then, I'd like to read you what I wrote about what he told me about meeting his birth family and what I observed. During his first 10-day trip to Louisiana, Marco met his birth mother and father, half siblings, and aunts and uncles on both the Cajun and Creole sides of the family. Upon his return, he bragged, "My visit was the most interesting thing that has happened to those families in a long time," which may or may not be true. Basking in the glow of reunion, he made a picture necklace fashioned out of plastic holders, the kind that convention attendees or hospital employees wear to hold a name tag. He cut and reassembled 5 of them, linking them together with paper clips. Marco put pictures of his newly discovered relatives back to back in each holder, so he could show off as many of them as possible. Around his neck, they twirled and sparkled like a string of jewels. The necklace expressed his joy of finding this family. He told me about each of his relatives pictured there, especially his birth mother and father. Now, this is a later chapter in my book, is called Tarnished Jewels. So this first joyous reunion became more complicated later on, which is very common in adoption. There's like this so-called honeymoon period, and then things get more complicated. And almost always adoptees return to the home of their adoptive family, because that's where they grew up, that's where they have all their connections. But Marco spent more time with his birth parents than many adoptees do. Okay, but when Marco found these birth parents and after I met them, I was really surprised by how much he had in common with both of them, because he had never met them, 5 days old, he didn't know them. And then he was 26, 27, 28, but he had the open personality and social skills of his birth mother and the intelligence of her brother. And he had the artistic and writing abilities of his father, and also shared his father's love of the outdoors. So it wasn't just that he looked like them, although he did look like the birth father, but that he had these traits in common with them. And, he had some things in common with me too, or some of those things I also shared. And a lot of the things that he had, I always had valued, but they weren't necessarily things that I had or that people in my family had. So I had never been interested in genetics. I'd always saw them as conservative and racist. And but I'd had a background in science as an undergraduate and social science. So I started looking at secondary literature about genetics. And I soon found this field called behavioral genetics, which was founded in the 1970s as a separate field to separate itself from the negative history of eugenics and using genetics for racist and anti-Semitic purposes. And what really got me interested in behavioral genetics, it was actually psychologists, quantitative psychologists, who started it, who didn't in the beginning have a background in genetics, and that's probably no longer the case. But what really got me interested is that most of their studies were done on adoptive and birth families and comparing certain characteristics, intelligent characteristics, but also reading and processing information. 13 cognitive skills. So 13 cognitive skills they compared. And then other researchers did personality traits. And what they found, and they did these studies over 20, 30 years, testing the birth mothers in the beginning along with the adoptive mothers. And then as the child grew up, they would test the children and also retest the adoptive mothers, but they didn't really usually have ongoing contact with the birth mothers. But when the adoptees were 16, 17, 18, about the time that the birth mothers had given up their children, they tested the adoptees again, and the adoptive parents, and they also had sort of what's called a control group. They also were following some biological families who were about the same class, and most of these families in the beginning were white. And what they found was that as the adoptees got older, they got more like the biological parents, mothers, most of whom they had never met, and hardly had anything in common in terms of these cognitive traits, in terms of personality traits, with the adoptive families or with other adopted kids in the family who had come from other families, or with the biological, or with if the parents, the adoptive parents also had their own biological children. They were all really different. And so it's really intuitive, counterintuitive, because you would think that once they had lived with the adoptive parents, they'd be like the adoptive parents. But in fact, they became less like the adoptive parents and more like the birth mother. Now, that didn't account for emotional ties and other kinds of things. It's sort of, these quantitative indicators. But to me, it was really interesting, and it helped me understand certain things. And then I looked at other, other things. Because when he had met his birth parents, not only did he have all these positive things in common with them, but I found out, both from him, mainly from him, that both of the birth parents the birth father and the birth mother had a history of addiction, drug addiction, and that when he met them, they all liked the same drug. So I had been having trouble understanding that he had addiction. Only later did I find out that he had his first puff of marijuana when he was 8 from a friend's mother. And that by 7th grade, he was both using marijuana and selling it. And he had gotten the marijuana from white friends, and he gained status in the Black community because he had access to marijuana and he knew about it. So that goes against stereotypes. And then by the time he was in his late teens and his early adulthood, he was for a while selling, but mainly using all kinds of hard drugs. And finally, I came to terms with it. I had had no experience with drugs. Even marijuana, I never liked it. And my friends called me a substance abuse virgin and really pressed me to go to Al-Anon, which finally I did. And so, I had sort of finally figured out that he was an addict and wanted to try to do something. And there was some psychological theories at the time that adoptees, through their sense of loss, had to compensate. So I said, well, maybe he's compensating with drugs because of the losses of adoption. So if I help him find his birth parents, maybe that will help. But I never envisioned that his birth parents would be addicts themselves. So at any rate, it didn't cure him going to meet them, which a therapist had told me. But finding this out and doing the research I did, and then doing research on addiction, both in behavioral genetics and other research on addiction, helped me understand what had happened to him. And behavioral genetics, another thing that I liked about them was that they were not genetic determinists. They were really as interested in the environment, not just the environment inside the home, but the environment outside the home. And I began to understand how the 1990s, when he was going from age 10 to age 20, was like a huge increase in drug availability in the United States, and especially in some place where I live, like in Berkeley and Oakland. And so the environment provided, and everybody, including me, was very loose about using marijuana. It's no big deal. But in fact, it was a big deal, and for somebody that as young as he was. And so I began to see how the environment and genetics interacted, like his genetic precondition and the wide availability of drugs and the sort of loose attitude towards it in my community created the situation where he could become an addict. There were these wonderful happy times when he was, especially from 5 to 12, but there was some trauma that he experienced in his early childhood, which I discuss in the book, which I found out could also be a precondition for addiction. And then there were all these troubled times from the time he was about 12 until still today. So I had a wonderful experience of adoption and a really troubled one. And the introduction to my book was written by Andrew Solomon, who I met and Marco met, and who's won some prize, whose books are prize winners. His first book, the first book that got a lot of recognition, Noonday Demon, which is about his own experience of chronic depression and that of other people. And then another book that he wrote, Far from the Tree, is about biological parents who are very different from their biological children. And he is now writing another book, which I think is going to be called Who Rocks the Cradle, where he's going to consider adoption and single parents, etc. But at any rate, he says in the introduction about me and my book, this is a book about the same lessons learned two ways: painfully by living them and restoratively by studying them. Kay Trimberger is given to neither effusion nor self-pity, and her intellectual nature frames this book, but the emotions nevertheless run high. So, and I think that's true. I think I do have a lot of intellectual analysis, but it's really integrated into a narrative that I think is very readable and is geared to a general audience. Now, there's a lot of anecdotes in my book about Marco's experience of racism and what I learned as a white person about race from raising him and seeing what happened to him. One thing that, when I adopted him, I thought that I was in a perfect situation to raise a Black, or in his case, biracial child. My block, my street, my neighborhood was a mixed class, mixed race one in Berkeley, which was a city that was very tolerant and did have not only mixed race people, but a lot of some Blacks and more Latinos. And Kamala Harris grew up in my city, a little older than Marco. And I was lived and my block was on the border of Oakland. Oakland was one block over, which had even more mixed race, mixed class thing. So I thought this was great. And certainly it was better for him than some adoptees of color who grow up in all white neighborhoods. But what I realized only after I had adopted was that my extended family, all of my friends, a lot of my colleagues, and the neighbors that I had become friendly with, they all were white and middle class. I didn't live in an integrated an integrated life. And if you read the new book on by Isabel Wilkerson Cast, you'll see why that happens and why it's very usual for a white person to live in a white world, even if they're in an interracial neighborhood. So I learned that an integrated neighborhood was not enough, and that one has to do more, or one has to already have an integrated life before you adopt. But I mean, I never regretted adopting. I really, it was wonderful for me. I don't know if it was wonderful for my son, but he says it was. And, he, you know, we're still very close, even though his life is completely different than mine. And I think that adoptive parents have to realize that they're not going to have a biological family, that it's going to be different from a biological family, but that it can be very satisfying. And and one way to make, if you're a white person adopting, to make your world more integrated is to form closer ties at a younger age with the biological family of race. So here is what I advocate, and I talk about bonds of friendship and community still anchor my life. But as I matured, I saw that they did not replace family ties. Adopting Marco helped me strengthen bonds to my biological family. I now see that I could have forged additional family connections with his biological family. If I had done so when he was younger, both he and I would have had a biological and an adopted family, different for each of us, but bringing a balance into our family life. My biological family was his adoptive one. His little biological family could have been my adoptive one. This would have benefited Marco. In a 2016 interview with author Andrew Solomon, an interview where I was not present, Marco said, "I wish I could have lived both lives." He was referring to his adopted life with me and to the reunion he had had with both birth families. He also said, "When I met my biological families and spent time with them, my feelings of insecurity were gone." If I had tried to maintain some contact with his birth families when he was young, he might have had this support earlier. I actually forgot to show a picture. This is Marco in 2010 with a nephew from the sister, half-sister that he became closest to was on the father's side. And even though she was 8 years younger, they looked alike and people called them the twins. And this is his nephew when he's there in 2010. My book was written primarily for adoptive parents, and adoptive parents have told me that they wish they had the book 20 years earlier. I mean, adoptive parents my age. So hopefully adoptive parents will learn from it. And adult adoptees have told me that it helped them rethink their experiences of adoption. And I think that parents, biological parents who aren't involved in adoption, they have told me that especially if they have troubled adult children that who are not children anymore, they're adults, but troubled sons or daughters, that this book helped them understand what had happened and to make them feel like it less guilty, that it might have been partly their fault, but it wasn't all their fault. So at any rate, I think that's about a half an hour, and we had said that I would stop and open it up for your questions and comments, which Sunny Rosen, who organized this and works for Louisiana State University Press, will field the questions. You should put them, I guess, in the chat, and she will then convey them to me, since I am not on Facebook. Okay, thank you for coming, and I hope you'll have some questions and comments, and that we can have more discussion.
Great. So our first question is from Christoph. He asks, where in Louisiana is the adoptees family from? Like the parish, not their specific, community, but which parish of Louisiana are we talking about?
Well, several, but they saw the book before it was published, but they were not consulted while I wrote it. So I have kept them anonymous, and I don't want to say the parish, but the town where he was born, but I don't think any of his birth family still live there, although maybe one does, is between Lafayette and Lake Charles, off of Highway 10. And his birth father, actually, I think is back in the hometown, but his wife at the time, who I became closer to, who was no biological relationship, they lived outside of New Orleans, across the bridge. But A, I can't remember the parish names, and B, I don't want to give them.
That makes sense. So next question is, what projects are you thinking about working on in the future? Are you thinking about writing more on this subject or other subjects?
Well, I'm writing blogs and some op-eds on this topic, and particularly more on race than I deal with in the book. But I'm not going to write another book. I'm too old, and and I'm just going to keep working on this topic. I'm interested. There's a lot of debates now in the adoption field, and I'll participate in some of them. And I have a blog site on Psychology Today. It's called Adoption Diaries, and I have had some guest blogs by adoptees, and I don't know if I've had any by birth parents, but I've written a bit about birth parents. So I'm going to keep doing that and doing some other writing of short pieces on this topic.
Okay, great. I think our next question is that you mentioned that the book is primarily aimed at adoptive parents and adoptees secondarily. If somebody doesn't fall into either of those categories, is there any information that other people could take from the book, maybe on how to be better neighbors to our, friends and community members that are going through adoption experiences?
Yes, I think all of the above. And actually, in the book, I give an example of a neighbor of mine across the street who hadn't seen my son for some time, and he saw this Black adult man going into my house, and he called the police, and he was really embarrassed, but afterward. And some of my friends are involved in something called Don't Call the Police to tell. So I think in terms of neighbors, that could help. But yes, and particularly any parents could, I think, learn something here, and any person involved in adoption one way or the other. Because I'm sort of self-critical. I mean, I adopted, as I said, in 1981, and things have changed over time, and I've learned a lot. And so that you can also get a bit of a history, and there's a lot about sort of Berkeley and California, if you're interested in that. And there's a lot about Louisiana and my visits there. And I was very happy that Louisiana State University Press wanted to publish this because that meant I had got what I wrote about Louisiana right, or at least right enough. So thank you for that question.
Okay, great. The next question is from Marty. She says, you seem to be very inclusive about everyone's perspective. How have you grown into this throughout the years? She's referring to things like considering the birth parents' perspective, the adoptive children's perspective, the adoptive parents' perspective, you know, all the different perspectives that are involved here. So can you talk about how you've grown into that inclusiveness over the years?
Well, I went to various, well, I've had experience, right? But then I also went to various, you know, tutorials, online, offline. And about more than 4 years ago, I helped start a support group for adoptive parents who have adoptive parents with adult adoptees. I mean, that their children have to be over 18. And that's been very helpful. But I think probably adoptees and probably birth mothers would still have some criticisms of me. I try to include their perspective and understand their perspective. I don't think I've completely succeeded in that. We still need their own voices along, and voices of people of color. And I was so happy that my son wrote this long afterward. And actually, if you want to, you can read his afterword in 2 parts on my blog on Psychology Today. But you know, because we really, in my book then, have his perspective. And I didn't always agree with what he said, but I didn't have him change anything that I disagreed with, because I thought, you know, it's his perspective and he needs to have that, and I need to hear it, and other people need to hear it. I mean, most of it I agreed with, and most of it he really read the whole book, and I told him he didn't have to read the science part, but he liked the science part, and he said he really learned from it. So at any rate, I think we still have a ways to go, and we still need all those voices. I mean, and some people have said, well, we've heard enough from adoptive parents, we don't need to hear them anymore. And I completely disagree with that. I think that other people can learn and we can learn. And I learned in writing the book that we need everybody's voices, and we can't exclude anybody's voices. And we can do things to try to get those voices who have been less represented. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, great answer. We have another question from Marty. She's asking, can you comment on things that have changed in the world of adoption recently?
Well, certainly 10, 20 years ago, there started to be an emphasis on open adoption. But open adoption can and has meant many things. It can mean just having a little contact with the birth parents in the beginning. It can mean once a year having some contact. It can mean that when they're 18, that the adoptees can contact the birth parents. And this is also true of people who use artificial insemination and sperm banks, etc. But this notion that I have that we should have much more ongoing contact, that's relatively new. And I don't know how many people accept it. And it's not easy because, especially if it's an interracial adoption, it often means that the white family, which is usually many more adoptive families are white, and there's many more children in foster care who are Black. It means often having contact across class and racial lines and cultural lines. And I have interviewed some people who have done that pretty successfully, and it's hard. It's not easy. And in my case, it would have been hard vis-a-vis the drug use. But in other ways, it's also been, I've learned a lot. It's also expands one's experience to cross class and race lines on a continuing basis with your children. Not only is it good for your children, I think it's good for the adoptive parents and good for the birth parents. Although sometimes it's hard for the birth parents because they're not raising the children. They're more like aunts and uncles maybe, and that's hard, but they also get to maintain contact with their birth child, and the adoptive parents get to expand their world. But I don't think that's widely accepted or widely practiced yet. And I don't think, well, there's sort of a mantra in adoption that the biology is important, but nobody really practices it or studies it or understands it. So I'm hoping that adoption researchers and academics who study adoption maybe will pick up from me that that's important to do and to continue to do and to figure out that part and how it interacts with the environment. And there are a few people, particularly at the University of Oregon, that are trying to figure out, if you know more about the biological background of a child, and not from genetic testing, but just from experience, that what can you do as a parent to foster the positive genetic predispositions and perhaps damp down the more negative ones of mental illness or addiction or so forth. And that can be useful also for biological parents. And I do talk about that in the book. So that I think that isn't really taken off yet. And I'm hoping, except sort of, you know, that there's a mantra, oh, the biology is important, but how that is important and how you as an adoptive parent or a biological parent can parent is a way in knowing that history of your child to better prepare them. And so I don't know if that's going to really happen, but I think it's important, and if it could happen. And as I said, it can affect both. Biological parents also often don't think much about their family background. They may know it. They may know that there's some alcoholism, that there's some addiction, that there's mental illness, but how does that affect their child, and what can they do as a parent when their child is young to counteract those genetic predispositions? Okay.
Great. Yeah. Our next question actually is right in line with what you were just saying. Christy asks, I have friends who have raised their biological biracial children as single moms. I think your work is very interesting for their lives as well. Do you talk about them in your book? And can you talk about that?
Yeah, I do. I talk about one of Marco's best friends was raised by a white single mom in our neighborhood, and who I don't think he had any contact with his Black father. And he and Marco became really good friends. They didn't go to the same schools when they were young, but by junior high they did. And that was important, except that his friend died and was shot when they both were 30, 10 years ago. And that was the only murder in Berkeley that year. And they haven't solved it yet. And you know, it's a bit unclear why that happened to him, because I always saw him as straighter and more committed to finding work for himself, and that he just grew some marijuana in the backyard. But you know, growing marijuana can, you know, when you can't put the money in a bank, and when before it was legal, who knows if how that related to his death. But anyway, it was extremely traumatic for my son. But the fact that there were and at his memorial service, Marco gave a very moving talk about him and about his family and what they did together and how important it was for him. So I do think that there's a lot in my book about race, even though I didn't theorize it, and that it does apply to particularly a white single mom raising sons and daughters of color without a person of color in the family. I think it's a hard situation, but the fact that you can connect with other people who have the same experience is useful.
Okay, great. I think that is our last question. So that's it for all the questions.
Well, thank you.